Ben McAllister had always been good at keeping secrets, but this one weighed heavier than all the others. It started innocuously, as these things often do. He'd been best friends with Lucas Forrester since the 3rd grade. 2 boys, inseparable, sharing everything. But no one, not even Lucas, could have known what would begin to stir inside Ben when he turned into a man. Lucas's father, Derek Forrester, was the kind of man that left an impression without trying. At 52, Derek was in the prime of his life. His athletic build, honed from years of working construction and early morning runs, belied his age. His confidence, his quiet authority, radiated with every word, every gesture. Ben couldn't help but be drawn to him, even though he'd never once questioned his sexuality before. Derek had been there, in the background, for as long as Ben could remember, picking them up from school, taking them on camping trips, always present, always the embodiment of the kind of man Ben thought he wanted to become. But somewhere along the way, admiration morphed into something deeper, something he hadn't asked for, and definitely didn't want. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Not with Lucas's father. The first time Ben noticed the shift was on one of those long, lazy summer afternoons. Lucas had invited Ben over to his place, as usual, for a weekend of beer, video games, and mindless chatter. But Lucas had passed out early after a few too many drinks, leaving Ben alone in the kitchen, sipping on water and contemplating the strange twist of fate that had placed him here, in Derek's house, alone. Derek had entered the room with the same quiet grace he always had, offering a nod and a smile. "Late night?" Derek asked, his deep voice washing over Ben in a way that made him nervous. Ben nodded, feeling an odd tension in the air. "Yeah, Lucas is already out cold." Derek chuckled, his eyes lingering on Ben just a second too long. That boy never could hold his liquor. For a moment, Ben wasn't sure what to say. The atmosphere had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. Derek leaned against the counter, his broad shoulders filling the space between them, and took a long sip from his drink. Ben felt an undeniable pull toward him, a tension that confused and excited him in equal measure. "How's everything been for you, Ben?" Derek asked, his tone casual but his eyes far more intense than the question warranted. "You've been quiet lately." Ben hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. He wasn't sure how to talk about the weight he'd been carrying. Not about the late-night thoughts, the confusion, and certainly not about the growing attraction that had taken root deep inside him. "I'm fine. Just school stuff, you know?" Derek's eyes didn't leave him, and Ben could feel the heat rising in his cheeks. "It's a lot to deal with, I know," Derek said, his voice softening. "But if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." It was a simple offer of comfort, something any father might say to his son's best friend, but the way Derek said it, the way his eyes lingered just a bit too long on Ben's face, sent a shiver through him. It was as if there was an unspoken understanding between them, something neither of them could name yet, but both felt in the air around them, and that's how it began, a series of small moments, each one building on the last, creating a tension that neither of them could ignore. They never spoke about it, but Ben found himself spending more time at Lucas's house, even when Lucas wasn't around. There were always excuses. A forgotten notebook, a casual stop by after school, but every time Ben showed up, he knew it was Derek he was hoping to see. The way Derek would glance at him, the way his hand would linger on Ben's shoulder for just a second too long, it was intoxicating. Forbidden, yes, but that only made it more thrilling. But guilt was a constant companion. Ben knew what he was feeling wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. Derek was Lucas's father, and Lucas was his best friend. If Lucas ever found out, Ben couldn't even let his mind go there. The thought alone was enough to stop his heart. He tried to push it all down, to lock it away where it couldn't hurt anyone. But it kept creeping back, stronger every time. The tipping point came one night when Lucas was out of town visiting his mom. Ben had shown up at the house, not realizing Lucas was gone, but Derek invited him in anyway. They sat in the living room talking about nothing in particular, but the air was thick with the tension that had been building between them for months. Ben tried to focus on the conversation, on anything other than the way Derek's leg brushed against his, the way Derek's eyes darkened when they met his own. It was Derek who broke the silence first. "You've been coming around here a lot lately, Ben." Ben's heart raced. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yeah, I guess." Derek leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. his gaze never leaving Ben's. "You don't have to pretend, I know." Ben felt like the floor had just dropped out from under him. He tried to play dumb, to act like he didn't know what Derek was talking about, but the look in Derek's eyes told him there was no use. They both knew. They'd known for a long time now. "Know what?" Ben managed to choke out, though his voice was barely above a whisper. Derek didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached out, his hand cupping the side of Ben's face, his thumb brushing gently over his cheek. Ben froze, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure Derek could hear it. This was it. This was the moment when everything would change. But there was more to the story than just the thrill of secrecy and stolen touches. For a few breathless seconds, Ben didn't move. His mind was racing, his emotions a chaotic whirlwind of fear, desire, and guilt. He knew this was wrong, that this could never end well, but he couldn't stop himself. Not now. Not after all this time. He leaned into Derek's touch, his breath hitching as their lips met in a slow, tentative kiss. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Ben had never kissed anyone like this before, never with so much fear and longing all tangled up together. It felt like everything and nothing all at once, a heady mix of excitement and dread. But as quickly as it began, it was over. Derek pulled away, his expression unreadable. "We can't do this," he said, though his hand remained on Ben's face, his thumb still brushing against his skin. Ben nodded, though he wasn't sure what he was agreeing to. His mind was still spinning, his body still buzzing from the kiss. "I'm Lucas's father," Derek continued, his voice hoarse. We can't." Ben knew he was right. Of course, he was right. But knowing something and feeling it are two very different things. Ben had been feeling this for months now, and there was no turning back from it. Not anymore. But it didn't end there. The kiss was just the beginning, and once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The pull between them was too strong, the attraction too powerful to resist. It would only get more complicated from here, more intense. And secrets, no matter how well kept, always have a way of coming to light. Ben's world had become a labyrinth of secrets, and as time passed, the walls of his hidden affair with Lucas Forrester felt like they were closing in. What had once felt thrilling and new was now suffocating. Each stolen moment with Derek feeling both intoxicating and dangerous. He knew they were walking a tightrope, but the pull between them was undeniable, and neither seemed ready to let go. Amelia Forrester, Lucas's mother, was a different presence entirely. While Derek was the center of Ben's obsession, Amelia had a quiet, almost eerie way of watching everyone in her family. She had always been an attentive mother, but lately, Ben had started noticing her gaze linger on him just a bit longer than usual. He wasn't sure if she knew anything about the affair or if it was just his own paranoia creeping in, but her eyes seemed to follow him wherever he went in the house. Still, she never said anything. Amelia was kind to Ben in the way a mother would be to her son's best friend. She made small talk, asked about his plans after high school, and was always pleasant, even offering him second helpings during dinner. But her silence, the way she seemed to always be nearby, left Ben feeling uneasy. One evening, Lucas and Ben were hanging out at the house playing video games in the basement. The familiar comfort of their friendship was a welcome distraction from the chaos swirling in Ben's mind. For a few hours, he could forget about the complicated web he'd spun with Derek and just be with his best friend. Amelia called down from upstairs, asking if they wanted anything. Ben's heart raced even though he knew it was irrational. She had no reason to suspect anything, he told himself, yet her voice seemed to carry an edge that he couldn't quite place. Lucas shouted back up, telling her they were fine, and the moment passed. Later that night, as they sat in Lucas's room scrolling through their phones, Amelia knocked on the door and asked if Ben had a minute. Lucas, engrossed in his conversation with Emily, barely noticed as Ben followed her downstairs. She led him into the kitchen where a pot of tea simmered on the stove, filling the room with a faint aroma of chamomile. Amelia poured a cup and offered it to Ben, who accepted it, though his hands trembled slightly. He wasn't sure why he felt so on edge around her now. She hadn't done anything overly suspicious, and yet her mere presence seemed to unsettle him in a way it hadn't before. "Everything all right, Mrs. Forrester?" Ben asked, his voice coming out more nervous than he intended. Amelia smiled softly, stirring her own cup of tea. "Of course, Ben. I just wanted to talk to you for a moment." Ben nodded, waiting for her to continue. She seemed to be choosing her words carefully, her eyes flicking over him as if she were assessing something. But whatever she was thinking, she kept hidden behind that composed smile. "You've been spending a lot of time here lately," Amelia said, her tone casual. Ben swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "Yeah, I guess so. Lucas and I, well, we've always hung out a lot." Amelia's smile didn't waver. "I'm glad Lucas has a friend like you. You've been good for him. He's had a lot on his mind lately." Ben nodded again, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "Yeah, he's been talking about college and stuff. I think he's stressed about the future." "I'm sure he is," Amelia replied, taking a slow sip of her tea. "But he's lucky to have you by his side. You've always been there for him." The compliment felt hollow, as if there were an unspoken meaning beneath her words that Ben couldn't quite grasp. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the table. "I was thinking," Amelia continued after a moment of silence, "why don't you and I take a little trip out of town this weekend? Lucas and his father will be busy with some errands, and I thought it might be nice for us to get away. A little mother-son bonding, if you will." Ben blinked, caught off guard by the suggestion. He had never been particularly close to Amelia, not in the way she seemed to be suggesting. Sure, I guess," he said, trying to hide his confusion. "Where would we go?" "There's a small cabin about an hour out of town," Amelia said, her voice as smooth as ever. "We used to go there when Lucas was little. It's peaceful. I think you could use a little break from all the chaos of school and everything." Ben hesitated. Something about the idea of being alone with Amelia made him uneasy, but he couldn't exactly refuse without raising suspicion. She was offering a perfectly normal gesture, after all. Maybe she just wanted to give him a break from the pressures of school and his complicated feelings about her husband. "Yeah, okay," Ben finally agreed. "That sounds nice." "Wonderful," Amelia said, her smile widening. "We'll leave early Saturday morning." The rest of the evening passed without incident, but Ben couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He tried to dismiss it as nerves. After all, he'd been on edge ever since the affair with Derek started, but there was something about the way Amelia had spoken to him, the way her eyes had lingered on him during their conversation, that left him feeling unsettled. Saturday morning came quickly, and before Ben knew it, he was sitting in the passenger seat of Amelia's car, watching as the city gave way to dense forests and winding country roads. Amelia was in high spirits, chatting casually about the cabin and how much Lucas had loved it as a child. Ben nodded along, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying every interaction he'd had with Derek over the past few months, wondering if Amelia had noticed more than she let on. The cabin itself was quaint, nestled deep in the woods, far from any signs of civilization. As they pulled up, Ben felt a strange sense of isolation wash over him. The trees towered overhead, casting long shadows over the small wooden structure. It was beautiful in a way, but also unsettlingly quiet. Amelia led him inside, showing him around with a warmth that felt almost out of place. She seemed genuinely happy to be there, reminiscing about the times she'd spent at the cabin with Lucas and Derek when they were younger. "I'm glad you agreed to come," Amelia said, her voice soft as they sat down on the porch overlooking the woods. "I've always liked having company here." Ben forced a smile, though his unease had only grown since they'd arrived. "Yeah, it's a nice place. Peaceful." Amelia turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I know things have been difficult for you lately, Ben. I just want you to know that I understand." Ben's heart skipped a beat. Did she know? Was this her way of confronting him without saying it outright? He tried to keep his face neutral, though panic began to bubble up inside him. What do you mean?" Ben asked, trying to sound casual. Amelia's gaze never wavered. "You've been carrying a lot of weight on your shoulders, but you don't have to. Not here. You can let it go." Ben shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure of how to respond. There was something in her voice, something he couldn't quite place, that sent a shiver down his spine. He wanted to ask her what she meant, to dig deeper into the cryptic things she was saying, but he was too afraid of what he might uncover. The day passed slowly, with Amelia taking Ben on a walk through the woods, pointing out different landmarks and sharing stories from her past. Ben tried to relax, but the knot in his stomach only tightened with every passing hour. Amelia was kind, almost too kind, and that kindness felt like a mask hiding something far more dangerous. As night fell, they returned to the cabin, and Amelia prepared a simple dinner of stew and bread. Ben sat at the table staring at his bowl, his appetite gone. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something inevitable and terrifying. Amelia sat across from him, her movements slow and deliberate as she stirred her stew. "You know, Ben," she said, her voice calm, "sometimes people do things they regret. But in the end, we all have to live with the consequences." Ben's hand tightened around his spoon, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Amelia looked up at him, her eyes cold and distant. "You'll see." Ben barely slept that night at the cabin, his thoughts a whirlwind of anxiety. Amelia had been distant, unsettlingly calm, and her cryptic words echoed in his mind. "You'll see." He didn't know what she was hinting at, but his gut told him that something was very, very wrong. Morning broke with a chill in the air, the mist rolling through the dense forest surrounding the cabin. Amelia seemed unnervingly cheerful as she prepared breakfast, her earlier cryptic demeanor replaced with a forced lightness. She hummed softly while scrambling eggs, as though nothing was out of the ordinary, while Ben sat at the table picking at his food, trying to make sense of everything. "Eat up," Amelia said, her tone sickeningly sweet. "You'll need your strength." Ben stared at her, dread seeping into his bones. He wanted to ask her what she meant, but he was too afraid of the answer. He needed to get out of there, needed to leave before something terrible happened. But they were isolated, miles away from the nearest town. His phone had no signal, and the roads were too winding for him to navigate on foot. Meanwhile, back in town, Lucas and Derek had begun to wonder why they hadn't heard from Ben or Amelia. It wasn't like Ben to go this long without checking in, especially with Lucas. Derek had tried calling his wife several times, but her phone went straight to voicemail, which only added to his unease. "Something's wrong," Derek said, pacing the living room as Lucas watched him, concern etched on his face. They should have been back by now. "Maybe they just decided to stay an extra day," Lucas suggested, though even he didn't believe his own words. His mother had always been punctual, and the fact that neither of them was answering their phones set off alarm bells in his head. Derek shook his head, his expression grim. Something's not right. He didn't say it out loud, but Derek couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Amelia had been acting strangely lately. She had been distant, watching him with eyes that seemed to bore right through him, and though she hadn't said anything outright, Derek suspected that she knew about the affair with Ben. And if she did, he couldn't begin to imagine what she was planning. "We need to go," Derek said finally, grabbing his keys. "We'll drive to the cabin and see if they're there." Lucas hesitated. "You don't think anything's happened, do you?" Derek didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look on his face said it all. The drive to the cabin was tense, the silence between father and son thick with unspoken fears. Derek kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched while Lucas stared out the window, his mind racing with worry. He had always trusted his mother, never once questioning her motives, but the way Derek was acting, so desperate, so panicked, made Lucas question everything. "Dad," Lucas finally said, breaking the silence, "do you think Mom's okay?" Derek gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I don't know." That was all he could say. He didn't want to tell Lucas the truth, didn't want to admit that his mother might not be the person they both thought she was. But deep down, Derek knew that Amelia had been holding on to something dark and twisted. And now, with Ben missing, Derek feared that whatever Amelia had been hiding was about to come to light. Back at the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. Amelia's pleasant demeanor had faded, replaced by a cold, calculating edge. She stood by the window, staring out at the trees as if she were waiting for something, or someone. "Ben," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Come with me. We're going for a walk." Ben's stomach dropped. The last thing he wanted to do was follow her into the woods, but he didn't see a way out. He couldn't just refuse. He had no way to leave the cabin on his own. So, with a heavy heart and a growing sense of dread, Ben followed Amelia outside. The woods were eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves under their feet. Amelia led the way, walking with purpose, while Ben trailed behind, his heart pounding in his chest. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting someone to appear out of the trees, but they were alone. Completely alone. After what felt like an eternity, Amelia stopped in a small clearing, turning to face Ben with an expression that sent chills down his spine. "Do you know why we're here, Oti?" she asked, her voice devoid of warmth. Ben shook his head, his throat too tight to speak. Amelia's eyes narrowed. "I know, Ben. I know what you've been doing with my husband." Ben's heart stopped. This was it. She knew. She had known all along. He began, but Amelia cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. "Don't lie to me, Ben. I've seen everything. The glances, the sneaking around. You've been having an affair with Derek, haven't you?" Ben's mouth went dry. He could feel the ground crumbling beneath him, his carefully constructed world falling apart. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though the words felt hollow. What could he possibly say to make this better? There was no excuse, no explanation that could justify what he had done. Amelia stepped closer, her expression twisted with fury. "You've ruined everything," she spat. "You think I didn't notice? You think I'm some stupid, oblivious wife who wouldn't see what was right in front of her?" Ben took a step back, his pulse racing. He could feel the rage emanating from her, and it terrified him. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his voice shaking. "I didn't want to hurt anyone." Amelia let out a bitter laugh. "Didn't want to hurt anyone? You've destroyed my family, Ben. You've destroyed my marriage." She reached into her coat pocket, and Ben's heart leaped into his throat when he saw the glint of metal. A knife. He stumbled backward, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to escape, but the woods were too dense, the cabin too far away. "I thought I could forgive Derek," Amelia said, her voice dangerously low. "I thought maybe he was just going through something. But you're the one who pushed him over the edge. You're the one who ruined everything." Ben turned and ran. He didn't think, didn't plan. He just ran. The trees blurred around him as he sprinted through the forest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear Amelia behind him, her footsteps pounding on the ground as she chased after him, her voice echoing through the trees. "You can't run from this, Ben!" she screamed. "You can't hide!" Ben's lungs burned as he pushed himself harder, weaving through the trees, desperate to get away. But Amelia was faster than he expected, her footsteps growing closer, louder. Panic surged through him and he stumbled over a fallen branch, crashing to the ground with a sickening thud. He scrambled to his feet, but it was too late. Amelia was already there, standing over him, the knife glinting in her hand. Her eyes were wild, her face twisted with rage. "You think you can just walk away from this?" she hissed, raising the knife. Ben's heart pounded in his chest, and he scrambled backward, desperate to put distance between them. "Please, Amelia," he begged, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." But Amelia wasn't listening. Her mind was made up. With a final, terrifying scream, she lunged at him, the knife slicing through the air. At that exact moment, Derek and Lucas arrived at the cabin, their hearts pounding with the same sense of urgency that had been building for hours. They found the cabin empty, no sign of Ben or Amelia inside. Panic surged through Derek as he scanned the room, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. "We need to find them," Derek said, his voice tight with fear. Lucas didn't argue. He could see the look in his father's eyes, the desperation, the fear, and it terrified him. Without another word, they both ran outside, heading into the woods, calling out for Ben and Amelia. As they ran, Derek's mind raced with guilt. He had known something was wrong with Amelia for a long time, but he had never imagined she would do something like this. He had underestimated her anger, her jealousy, and now Ben was paying the price. They searched the woods for what felt like hours, the tension building with every passing minute. And then, finally, they heard it. A voice. Faint, but unmistakable. Derek's heart leaped in his chest as he followed the sound, pushing through the dense underbrush until they came to the clearing. What they saw would haunt them forever. Amelia stood over Ben, the knife in her hand, her expression a twisted mask of rage. Ben lay on the ground, blood pooling around him, his eyes wide with terror. "Mom?" Lucas's voice was barely a whisper, disbelief and horror washing over him as he took in the scene. "What did you do?" Amelia turned to face them, her eyes wild and unhinged. "He ruined everything," she said, her voice eerily calm. "I had to stop him." Derek stared at his wife, the woman he had once loved, the mother of his child, and barely recognized her. Her face, usually calm and composed, was twisted with an expression that was both terrifying and heart-wrenching. The knife glinted in her hand, still stained with Ben's blood. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Derek could hear nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat, thundering in his ears. Lucas, standing frozen beside him, could only mutter in disbelief, "Mom, what did you do?" Amelia tilted her head as though considering her son's question. There was a strange, almost serene calmness in her eyes now, like she had made peace with what she had done. "I did what I had to, Lucas," she said softly, her voice devoid of emotion. "He was destroying us." Lucas's mouth moved, but no words came out. He was still staring at the blood pooling on the ground, his mind struggling to process what was happening. Ben, his best friend, lay motionless, his chest barely rising, his eyes wide with shock and pain. The reality of it all was too much for Lucas to comprehend. "He was destroying us?" Lucas repeated, his voice breaking. "Mom, Ben didn't do anything." Amelia's expression darkened, the peaceful mask she had been wearing slipping away to reveal the deep bitterness and anger that had been festering beneath the surface. "You don't know what he did, Lucas. You don't know how he manipulated your father, how he—" "Stop!" Lucas shouted, the word tearing from his throat. Tears streamed down his face as he took a step toward his mother, his hands trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "Stop blaming him. This is you. You did this." Derek, finally shaking free from his paralysis, stepped between them. "Amelia, put the knife down, please," he said, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through him. "We can fix this." "Fix this?" Amelia laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that sent shivers down both men's spines. "There's nothing left to fix, don't you see that? You've been so blinded by him that you can't even see what you've done to this family." Derek felt his throat tighten. He had known, deep down, that Amelia had been suffering, that their marriage had been unraveling long before Ben had come into the picture. But he had never expected this, never imagined that she would take her jealousy and anger to such an extreme. "Amelia," Derek began again, his voice softer now, more pleading. "It's not too late. Just put the knife down and we can figure this out. We can still help Ben." But Amelia wasn't listening. She looked down at the knife in her hand, as though noticing it for the first time, then backed up at Derek with a strange, distant expression. "You think I'm the problem?" she said quietly, her voice trembling. "But it's him. It's always been him. Ever since he came into our lives, you haven't looked at me the same way. You haven't loved me the way you used to." Derek's heart ached. He wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that things hadn't changed because of Ben, but because of the years of distance that had grown between them. But now wasn't the time. Now, all that mattered was stopping her before things got any worse. "Amelia, I'm sorry," Derek said, taking a cautious step toward her. "I'm so sorry for everything, but this isn't the way to fix it." For a moment, it looked like she might listen. Her grip on the knife loosened slightly, her eyes filled with uncertainty. But then she looked down at Ben again, and whatever softness had been there vanished. "No," she whispered. "It's too late for that." Before Derek or Lucas could react, Amelia lunged forward, the knife raised. But Derek was quicker. With a swift, desperate movement, he grabbed her wrist, wrenching the knife from her hand and tossing it aside. Amelia let out a cry of frustration, struggling against him, but Derek held her firmly, his arms wrapping around her in a desperate embrace. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "Amelia? Stop! Please!" For a few moments, she struggled, kicking and thrashing in his arms, her cries echoing through the forest. But then, as if all the fight had drained out of her, she collapsed against him, her body shaking with sobs. "I loved you," she whispered, her voice broken. "I loved you so much, Derek." Derek closed his eyes, his heart breaking as he held her tightly. "I know," he whispered back. "I know." Lucas, still frozen in shock, finally moved. He dropped to his knees beside Ben, his hands hovering over his friend's body, unsure of what to do. "Ben," he choked out, tears streaming down his face. "Ben, please, wake up." Ben's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment Lucas thought he might be okay. But the blood. There was so much blood. Ben's lips parted and he whispered something, but Lucas couldn't hear it over the sound of his own sobs. "Stay with me," Lucas begged, his voice barely audible. "Please, stay with me." Derek, still holding Amelia, watched in horror as his son cradled Ben's head in his lap, rocking back and forth as though he could somehow will him back to life. But deep down, they all knew it was too late. Ben's breath came in shallow gasps, his eyes unfocused, his body limp. And then, with one final, shuddering breath, he was gone. Lucas let out a heart-wrenching scream, his grief echoing through the trees. Derek couldn't hold back his own tears as he looked down at his wife, the woman he had once loved, the woman who had just torn their family apart. Amelia was still sobbing quietly in his arms, but her eyes were empty, her face pale and gaunt. She had done it. She had destroyed everything. The aftermath of the murder was a blur of flashing lights and sirens, police officers combing through the forest as paramedics arrived to take Ben's body away. Lucas sat on the porch of the cabin, his face buried in his hands, his body trembling with grief. He hadn't spoken since the paramedics had arrived, too lost in his own horror to process what had happened. Derek stood nearby, watching as the police led Amelia away in handcuffs. She didn't resist, didn't say a word. She simply walked, her head down, her eyes vacant. It was as though life had drained out of her the moment she had realized what she had done. Derek wanted to hate her. He wanted to scream at her, to tell her how much she had ruined, but all he felt was an overwhelming sadness. Amelia had been sick for a long time, and he had ignored it. He had let their marriage fall apart, had turned a blind eye to her pain, and now Ben was dead because of it. Lucas finally looked up, his eyes red and swollen. "Dad," he said, his voice hoarse. "Why? Why did she do it?" Derek didn't know how to answer. How could he explain the twisted jealousy that had consumed Amelia, the years of resentment that had festered beneath the surface until it had exploded in violence? How could he tell his son that the woman they both loved had been capable of such a horrible act? "I don't know," Derek said finally, his voice breaking. "I don't know." In the wake of unimaginable loss, Lucas Palmer faced the reality that his family had been irrevocably destroyed. Amelia's jealousy, long simmering beneath the surface, had ultimately led to a violent act that shattered the lives of everyone involved. Derek, unable to reconcile the horrors of what had happened, disappeared into the silence of his grief. In the end, 2 lives were lost and a third may never fully return from the shadows. The question remains, could it all have been prevented?